On the Jaguar XJS, Jaguar chose to use a 2 psi system to vent fuel vapors. This means that pressure in the fuel tank can be expected to build to 2 psi before venting of fuel vapors occurs. Now on Jaguar XJSs, primarily those before 1990, but also affecting many of the pre-facelift cars, there are issues with proper fuel tank venting. This often manifests by a whooshing sound that you'll hear when you open the fuel filler cap, and perhaps along with that you may hear some oil canning sound from the tank itself. Additionally, while fuel smells in the boot of these cars is a known thing that can have multiple potential causes, high fuel tank pressure could exacerbate some of those and be the root cause of some of the issues with fuel vapor smell in the boot. So today we're going to explore a little bit how these systems work in Jag, talk about the recall, talk about how they're set up, and we're going to go ahead and fix the one on our 1999 XJS convertible. It's going to probably be a long video. We're going to spend some time discussing these various items before we get into the video, so we'll put chapters in and you can skip around. But what I'm hoping this becomes is a kind of taking all the data that's out there, picking through it, and presenting that to you here as a really fine overview of the fuel tank vent systems in these Jags and how to repair it. So why are fuel tanks vented? It's important to cover the basics here. In a general sense, your fuel tank is not a fully sealed item. The tanks need to be able to vent or breathe, both breathe in and breathe out. You see, fuel gives off vapors. Like many vapors, gases, and liquids, the density can change based on several factors, including temperature and altitude. So, what if the tank was sealed and not vented? Let's consider this. A half-full tank, closed and sealed at 60 degrees Fahrenheit. Then that tank sits in the sun and heats up to 85 Fahrenheit. In this case, the pressure will rise in the tank, causing it to want to expand outward. Here's another scenario. Again, a tank that's half full. Now in this case, the vehicle's running, but the tank is sealed aside from the pull of fuel from the engine. As the fuel leaves the tank, what replaces it? Well, normally air would take up that space, but if it's sealed, that means a vacuum will start to develop, resulting in the tank having less pressure. This can cause the tank to want to compress inwards, and in extreme cases, even collapse or implode. So as you can see, a sealed fuel tank is going to have problems. Indeed, proper venting is important. That tank has to breathe. Now this has been handled in different ways throughout the years. Very early cars simply had open vents that just went to air and atmosphere. But we've gotten better at handling fuel vapor emissions, and we've devised things like charcoal canisters, vapor separators, and even modern sealed vapor recovery systems. For Jaguar with the XJS though, they had a bit of an issue with their particular tank venting setup. Okay, so let's talk about the stock XJS setup. We'll first focus on the pre-recall. Recall we'll talk about in a second, of course. Now, there might have been different setups of the fuel tank venting prior to a recall that occurred in 1990. And it probably depends a little on the model year, tank setup, etc. But from what I can tell, many of those cars have a vapor charcoal canister and they use a 2 psi check valve. And that is actually prone to failure and is something that we're going to talk about. So that led to a recall. In September of 1990, the NHTSA issued recall number 90V123. Now, per the recall notice in the USA, this covered Jag XJSs from 1978 through 1990 and stated as follows. Excessive fuel vapor pressure can occur that after prolonged cycling could weaken the fuel tank structure. The recall then goes on to talk about the fix. The main fix for the recall was simply to add what Jaguar simply called, in quotes here, a revised fuel purge system. Now what this fix actually entailed was the addition of what is called a Rochester valve on many of the forums and documents. You've probably seen that term. Now Jaguar refers to this part as a pressure control valve, giving it part number CBC7714, which of course we will see and show is no longer available. Now if we want to understand what part that really is, Rochester valve kind of gives us some hints, as Rochester is a company that supplied all kinds of things to various car makers like General Motors. And in fact, this Rochester valve, as it's called, is a common item used on many GM cars in the 1980s and 1990s. Specifically, the Rochester valve utilizes a vacuum source to open its flow direction in one way when the car is running, but it also acts like a 2 psi check valve when the car is off. But again, about this being a GM part, a similar or perhaps even the same part was used extensively by GM as a canister vent valve on various applications from 1984 through 2004. Now that means that a GM alternative can be used, specifically AC Delco part number 214-552. Now of course another thing to be aware of is that the canister and tank end of this valve are apparently swapped from that original Jag CBC 7714. So if you're replacing an existing valve, just pay attention to the labels on the new part and match it up appropriately. In our case, that AC Delco part number wasn't available, but I did find a few aftermarket sources, which we'll link in the video. Now here's a list of some aftermarket parts, brands and numbers that should work for you. Of course, we have AC Delco 214-552. There's also Standard Motor Products CP112, which is actually the part we're going to feature in this video. Napa has part CRB 228037. AutoZone sells one under Duralast part number PV132. WVE has one as 2M1005. And Dorman sells a replacement under part number 994093. As we look at the recall data, we certainly know that Jag did this fix by installing the Rochester valve, or this pressure control valve as they call it. And the question then becomes, where is that recall fix located? Or if you have a post-recall vehicle, where is it located? So we're going to go over all the common spots that these would be based on what type of XJS you have. But I think it's important to preface that, especially for the recalls that were done, you never know if a specific dealer might have not followed the procedure exactly. They could have stored the Rochester valve somewhere different. It could have ended up somewhere different based on the hoses. So it's a guide, but it's probably not going to hit every single car out there. So let's talk about normal recall locations. Now, based on the diagrams and the data I've gathered, it appears the main location for the addition of the Rochester valve by Jag would be at the rear of the vehicle, with the vacuum source being teed off the vacuum line going into the ECU. In these cases, it appears the Rochester valve should then be stored above the fuel tank, and most likely it's on its right-hand side from looking at the back, or right-hand side of the vehicle. For coupe cars, it's most likely to be found upwards into the right-hand buttress. On convertibles that are from Jag, you'll probably find it above the tank on the right side. However, there are alternative locations, and we're actually going to prefer to use one of these on our video today. Now, the Rochester valve may be near the charcoal canister, which is located forward of the left-hand front wheel behind the wheel well liner. Some have even said that dealers place the valve under the bonnet, which I thought I found on our car until I quickly realized that no, it was the purge valve, which is a Rochester valve. So perhaps people stating this had experienced mistaken identity under their bonnets. Totally understandable on these cars. Okay, so when you're going looking for your Rochester valve, it probably also makes sense to talk a little bit about the variations of tank and vent setups that exist on submodel. Because A, it'll help you find your Rochester valve, but B, it'll help us understand a little bit how the vent setups from the factory should be. Now we're going to focus on the V12 cars. The 3.6 car does show on Jag Classics as having a unique setup. It appears to even have some sort of a solenoid valve, which is interesting. I don't know much more about these vent setups, but hopefully the info presented here is helpful to you if you have one. And certainly, go ahead and drop a comment if you do with any detail you think could help any owners. Now, throughout its run, the XJS did have a few variations in its fuel tank design. Understanding this is going to help you better understand how the vent systems can be expected to look depending on the car that you have. For instance, if you see pictures from someone with a coupe but you have a convertible, well, you're certainly going to notice some differences. So let's take a brief look at images of the main fuel tanks. We're going to focus on the big main tank, not that supplementary sump tank that's in the boot. First up is the XJS Coupe, or Coupe. From what I have seen and researched, there appears to be at minimum 2 main tanks used on Coupe XJSs, the early and later tanks. Now, WelshNet has a great infographic that outlines these differences. Now, I'm going to show that here on the screen, but I'm also going to put a link to this in the video description because they definitely deserve the link and the props for that. As you can see, the older tanks show a smoother lower sheet metal portion, and it has a 90-degree fitting, whereas the later tanks have a ribbed lower sheet metal and a curved fitting. Definitely better for driving pleasure. All right, well, jokes aside, I would imagine that the ribbed sheet metal is stronger and probably helps oil canning in negative pressure. Kind of makes you wonder if they knew something was up. As far as I know, these two tanks are what you'll find in the XJS coupes. However, I do know that the late 6-liter Jaguar sport cars had their own tanks, both coupe and convertible. Now, in regards to the two different coupe tanks, if you know of any other changes in the model run, please leave us a comment below. Share it with the rest of the folks here. Now, before I get sidetracked, let's talk about how the coupe tank vents. Now, on the top right of the rear side of the tank are 3 hoses. These are the fuel tank vent lines. And these can be better seen in this diagram from Jaguar Classic Parts. The fuel tank separator mounts upward on the right side of the tank. As I understand it, it's up in the buttress area of the car. Now, this is important because on coupes, fuel vent valves that were part of the recalls are often placed here. More on this in a bit. Next up is the Cabriolet. It's a slight variant of the coupe. Now this is kind of what Jaguar had for the XJS that was pre-convertible. You've probably seen this one, right? It had the retractable soft top and it was kind of enclosed in that fully framed side glass type setup. Pretty cool cars for sure. But as you can see, the buttresses are not present on this version. There appears to be a slight change in the tank for these cars. The 3 hoses are replaced with a vent line, a vapor separator mounted above the tank, and we can even see a pressure check valve after that. Again, we're going to have more on this later in the video. Next up is the Hess Eisenhardt convertibles. Now, as you may already know, these were the first XJS convertibles. Commissioned by Jaguar for the 1988 model year, 2,100 of these convertibles were produced by upfitter Hess Eisenhardt. Now, they used a very unique fuel tanks due to the design of their hood, or as in the US we call it the convertible top. You can see this in these images for a tank for sale on eBay, because in fact I can't even find tank diagrams for this on Jaguar Classic Parts, so we'll go off these images. But these are only half the story. Again, due to the design of the hood, and as many know, the Hess and Eisenhardt tops retract a little deeper into the car when down, these cars have a very unique setup. They actually feature dual fuel tanks. That main tank, being a standard coupe tank, it's essentially cut down and re-welded with a slope added. Then a second tank, which we can see here in this eBay listing, is placed in the rear parcel area where the rear seats would be in a coupe. There isn't a ton of detail though on these Hess and Eisenhardt cars, including any good clear images of the main tank and its vent setup. However, as these are cut down tanks, they most likely have a vent line come off them that goes to a vapor separator, and then I believe they do utilize the same pressure check valve. Again, if you've got a Hess and Eisenhardt car and you want to share any details of the vent setup that we missed here, please leave us a comment. Now let's talk convertible. By 1989, Jaguar had figured out how to make the convertible XJS and ceased outsourcing of the build to Hess and Eisenhardt. They now built them in-house. Jaguar's revised design included a tank unique to the convertible. Now note that the post-facelift cars in the mid-90s may use a slightly different setup, but this is the tank design that we're going to feature prominently in this video with our 1989 XJS convertible. So with all that said, we're going to go ahead and focus on our 1989 XJS convertible, and you can come along as I, learn about the recall, the tank setup on this car, and then implement the eventual fix. We're going to start off today by showing how I almost got tripped up thinking I found the Rochester valve under the bonnet, but quickly realized it was a similar valve and part of the purge valve setup. All right, so back on our whole fuel tank venting situation, we're going to try to talk through this and explain what I think I've figured out. We're going to start up here. You can see this right here. This is where the bottom piece would connect, which is right there. And so I had pulled this out to check something on it because with these, let me show you the other one. So this is the replacements. You can see it. They have the canister side and the tank side. If I were to blow through the tank side at approximately 2 psi, I would overcome the one-way valve. If I blow through the canister side, I can't overcome it. And I did test on this one's pretty easy to blow through. I can blow about 2 psi and boom, there we go. I tested the same on this one, and it does appear to also do that. And we tested it earlier. The vacuum piece is working as well. So this is working fine, but this isn't our Rochester valve, even though it works very similar. This is technically referred to on the car's vacuum diagram as the purge valve. This one side, this hose here, which is not where it normally routes, but this hose comes up to your manifold, into manifold vacuum. And the other side, this side goes down and into the canister. And you can kind of see that down here. You see, that's where it goes into the fender. And then that's where it comes out of the fender, and then it goes into our canister. There is this other line here that loops up and around. Whoops, don't need an extra light. And that goes into this hard line, which can then be seen here with a little bit of flex hose and then more hard line, and we'll see that again under the car. So I'm going to jack the car up here and we'll get under it and take a look. But the key point being, what I believe is this car is a pre-recall setup that the convertible is specific to. Did not have the recall done and does not actually have a Rochester valve. Now, why we're having tank venting problems, I'm a little bit perplexed on. We haven't quite figured out, but I'm pretty certain that our fix partially is going to be to add the Rochester valve, but we're also going to take a look under the car and show you why I believe that. Now, before we raise the car up, we're going to take a look in our boot. And as you can see with our laser pointer, I have several of the bolts removed on this back panel. Now, unfortunately, the back panel doesn't want to release very easily because of the curvature of some of these lines. I don't want to remove these lines and deal with compression fittings or anything like that. I just don't want to disturb that right now. But I was able to pull it away enough to look behind, especially with my borescope camera, and I was able to see that there is no Rochester valve on this side upwards. Now, I believe on the coupes, because you have your buttress, you actually have some room up there, and that's where they'll store some of the equipment. I think on some of the older tanks, there's the separator, and there's even a Rochester valve, and the refits when they did the recall can be stored up there. So if you've got a coupe, take a look up there. All right, let's head under our vehicle, and immediately we're going to start to see some things here. So first off, this line right here, as we follow that, that is going to go up and into our wheel well. So this line right here is our line that goes to the charcoal canister. This line here is the fuel return, and this line, I'm pretty sure, is brake line. On this side, this should be the fuel feed, I'm pretty certain. So fuel feed, fuel return, brake, evap. Now we're going to look back towards the vehicle, and we're going to see those lines kind of come together here, and we're going to see that this one should be our brake line, this should be our fuel return, this should be our evap. Okay, so it's a little hard to see, but yeah, so that brake line finds its way into that bulkhead connector and into the flex line that goes across to our brakes. We then have the fuel return line is here, and if we were to follow that one, it goes up and over and then it kind of comes down into your bulkhead fitting. Okay, so that's your fuel return. Now don't get too confused by this. This is your emergency brake or parking brake cable. So it looks like this line right here is our evap line. Now, that does raise the question, what is our issue with our evap line? This is not a Rochester valve. This is probably a 2 PSI check valve. And most likely it's failed, because the question I would have is what is between here and the evap canister that could cause the fuel vapors to back up and pressurize the tank. So that would probably be this. Now the other thing would be a blockage in the line. So the things we can do here are remove that and make sure that we can blow through the line to the canister, that there's no blockages in the line. And what I would probably do is get rid of that, and I think this is what the recall did. It got rid of the check valve and then replaced it with the Rochester valve. And I think that's our game plan to fix our fuel pressurization issues. We're essentially going to do the recall. Now, if I was a smarty pants, I'd call my local Jaguar dealer and say, I have an emissions recall that I need done, and I would ask them to do it for me. But I'm not cheeky. Well, this is a non-recall version of the evap system on an '89 convertible. And well, we're going to convert it to the Rochester valve up front. All right, so we've got the valve down, and this is the direction that it points. And well, oh, it takes a lot to blow it that way. What's interesting, if I flip it around, it's like nothing. So I'm surprised because when I look at this, and I'll show you some photos on the phone up close, it was oriented the right way. It says this is the tank side and this is the canister side, yet super easy to blow through. Very, very tough to blow through. At any rate, I'm pretty sure this is our issue. What I'm still going to do though is hook up an extra hose down here and try to just blow through that way and make sure I can blow through the line completely. All right, so I've got this line hooked up into our hose, and I'm just trying to blow through it. That's not the easiest thing, but I'm blowing through quite a lot of line into a carbon canister. Seems to blow just fine. So I don't think we have a blockage in the line, and it's a lot easier to blow through this than it is to blow through the check valve. So this isn't the restriction. I can also just double check the other side and go into the tank side. That uses a smaller hose, so we'll just get a different one rigged up and try it. But barring no issues there, the next time you see us, we'll have bypassed this line here with a straight piece, and we're gonna run straight and put our Rochester valve in the front. Something like that. I don't even know what I'm talking about. All right, let's show you our handiwork. We have eliminated that check valve or whatever, the pressure valve that was there. What I've done for the time being is I've just simply put a union in, a 1/4 inch union, seemed to fit perfectly. And this looks to be 1/4 inch line the whole way. Interestingly, the backside of the valve had a 3/8 barb on it, and there was a 3/8 to 1/4 inch reducer used. So I've eliminated all that and just put a section of PCV style line. So let's go ahead and get our Rochester valve installed, but in the very least, this should stop the overpressurization of the tank immediately. Instead of showing us cut and install the lines, we'll skip ahead and show you exactly what we did to install the Rochester valve here. All right, we have our Rochester valve installed. So what we've got here is a 5/16 line that goes to our canister, and it is in the canister side of our Rochester valve. And then on the tank side, I have a 5/16 piece of hose here going into a 5/16 union, which I have put onto a 1/4 inch line, which goes into our piece here. I did not have a 5/16 to 1/4 inch reducer handy, so that's the solution that I picked for now. But that goes into our hose, and then of course I have a vacuum line, and I have plenty of it. We just need to route this into the engine bay and find a vacuum source to connect it to. But in the meantime, just sitting still with the car off, this should be a 2 PSI check valve. So this should work for us. We shouldn't have any tank pressure issues while the vehicle's sitting now. So we will be able to test that as we go along here. The vent on the top of the canister, as far as I know, is supposed to be open. So just a heads up on that. There's a wiring grommet we could go through. There's also the grommet here for this pipe. I don't know if there's enough room. A few more pictures with our phone camera just to kind of get you some better close-ups of it. You can see our long line here. What I was talking about was this grommet where our main line goes into the car. There's not really room to shove this vacuum line in there without risking pinching something. So what we can look to do is make another line and see what's behind here. We can also just show you how the line goes over. I mentioned the union. So you can kind of see that pretty good there. We were able to push the 1/4 inch line over the 5/16 barb. And again, we're going down into our main line here. And if you look on the back, you can see we have the canister side and the tank side. This is our solution. And now we just got to get to a vacuum source and we'll be in good shape. All right, and we have it set up. Here is our vacuum line. Here's our new grommet. We painted the part that we drilled so we wouldn't have any rust issues. And we can also even come around here and put a little sealant around that if we really want to. But this grommet's tight enough, the line is not moving. There should be plenty under the bonnet to make a connection. Now we see if we have any issues with our tank venting while the car sits. And then of course, when the car is running, this should work. Now I'm planning to hook this up to the same vacuum source that the purge valve is connected to. The concept that I have there is that we'll open up the tank venting on the same delay as the purge valve. I'm gonna think about that one for a little bit, but that's my plan. I think that's accurate. If not, I could just route to a normal, tee into a normal source and be done with it. And here's our vacuum line that came in. Like I said, we got plenty of it. I think the easiest one, and just to keep another hose out of the engine bay as much as possible, kind of makes sense to me to tee into this one. And you know, honestly, we could tee before the delays, which wouldn't be that hard to do. Right here at this elbow and go into there. So that's actually probably what I'm going to do. Unless there's a reason to have this on time delay, I'm going to go ahead and turn that old elbow, which is probably pretty brittle and going to break. I can turn that into a T-fitting and have my line teeing off of that and then have this going into the delay. So that's probably what I'm going to do. Just to close the loop on our purge valve assembly, you can see our purge valve. We put a new vacuum line on. And our vacuum line that we ran from the car, or from our Rochester valve through our grommet, that now goes. We got rid of the elbow here and put a T. So instead of an elbow, we have a T. So the Rochester valve will work on straight vacuum, whereas the purge valve will work on the delay. Nice. Well, we've done this a couple times, and I'd say it's probably fixed. Here's a few notes about our fix. Now, first off, we could have added the Rochester valve in the rear as Jag often did. However, it would have required teeing off the ECU's vacuum lead. While I'm sure this is fine, and well, frankly, it's what Jag did, quite honestly, I just didn't want to disturb it or add another breakpoint in that long line. Plus, I would have had to take apart the rear tank shield panel, probably disconnect some lines to go ahead and reach my hands back in there and fit all the Rochester valve assembly and properly tie it up. So I ended up putting it where many others have, next to the charcoal canister in the front of the left-hand wheel well. Now there's one more thing out there, to solenoid or not to solenoid. You see, many folks have expressed issues with the Rochester valves failing. So there's two main solutions to this. Number one, you can install fuel filters on either end of the Rochester valve to ensure that no debris can enter it. And then option number two, you can use a standard check valve for when the car is off. However, when it's running, you would plumb in a 12-volt powered solenoid operated by the key, so that valve opens up when the key is on, basically opening the venting up when the vehicle's running. Now, many people do seem to like option number two, but to me it's added wiring and plumbing and complexity that has to be done with care to make it look nice, and well, frankly, I was kind of feeling lazy. I think it's just easier to do option number one. So I ended up doing option one, but well, I even got lazier, as you'll see. You see, I only added a single filter, well, because it's all I had in the shop at the time, and I intend to add the second one at some point, but as of right now, I still haven't. You see, I added the one that I had on the side of the valve that goes into the charcoal canister. Of course, the thought being there is that as the line inhales, there's a chance that it might suck small bits of charcoal out of the canister and pull it into the Rochester valve, jamming it up, making it not work. And it seems that the chance of any debris coming from the other direction would be a lot lower because it's the big line that goes to the tank. Of course, it will be prudent and cheap to add that second filter, but if you're only going to do one, do it on the charcoal canister side. So if you liked what you saw here, do us a big favor. Drop us a like, subscribe, and of course, comment your thoughts and your experience as well. We'd love to hear it. In the meantime, we'll definitely have more for you here on Vortex Garage.